Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Paulette Castillo. I'm a first year studying history and literature here at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and the JFK side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the closest exit to you and congregate at the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Director of Membership for the JFK Junior Forum Student Committee, Celia Rees.
Good evening and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum. My name is Celia Rees and I'm a sophomore here at Harvard College and a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. Tonight, we are excited to host a very important conversation on the migrant crisis, one of the most pressing issues facing our country today, and one of the most critical issues in the 2024 presidential election. Our panelists this evening are Bill de Blasio, a Democrat who served as mayor of New York City from 2014 to 2021, and Jeff Denham, a Republican who served as congressman from California's 10th Congressional District from 2013 to 2019. As the elected officials are from different parties, different parts of the country, and different branches of government, we look forward to their unique perspectives on this issue. Our moderator this evening is Professor Jacqueline Bhabha. Professor Bhabha is the professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer in Law at Harvard Law School, and an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
So, good evening. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, our illustrious panel, for being with us here today. So, to start with, I don't think any of us in the room need reminding that immigration globally is a very hot-button issue, whether you're talking about Spain or Mexico or Bangladesh or Turkey or South Africa. And of course, we don't need reminding that migration crossings between the US and Mexico in particular are a burning political issue. I think we're all on the same page on that. And it's also, I think, not at all controversial to say that countries on all continents are witnessing large-scale arrivals of desperate migrants fleeing conflict, persecution, intolerable living conditions of one sort or another, and that these arrivals are seeing rises in the electoral success of the far right, who spout anti-immigration views and create often a very tense climate for these new arrivals. And we are also seeing situations where some local communities who have been very supportive of migrants in the past are now showing some sense of resentment. So this is a really challenging time, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on. It's a really important political issue. In the US, in particular, for the second year in a row, the number of migrant encounters, as the Immigration Service calls it, at the US-Mexico border has reached historical highs, nearly 2.5 million people a year. Some argue that this is the most contentious political issue in the US as we head into an election. So our question today, the migration crisis, how did we get here and where do we go next, could not be more pertinent. So I'm really glad we have this opportunity to discuss it. Just for a second, before I turn to our illustrious panelists, let me just start by saying that not everybody agrees with the crisis narrative. In a very recent op-ed in the LA Times, Karen Musalo, a very well-known leading immigration lawyer, argues that the crisis narrative about the border is false. She says, and she makes these following 3 points. A, the number is high of people arriving, to be sure, but there were comparable figures in the around the year 2000. So if we managed then, why can't we manage now? Her second point, other much poorer countries than the US are coping with much higher rates. 2.48 million migrant arrivals is less than 1% of the US population. Poland has received 3 times as many Ukrainians, and Costa Rica 10 times as many forced migrants. So why would this be a crisis for a country as rich and powerful as the US? And the third point that Karen Masalo makes is, of course, that immigrants are a net positive, both economically and socially. A recently released economic and budget forecast by the non-partisan Congressional Budget Office predicts an increase of $7 trillion in revenues as a result of immigration. So I don't know whether we all agree with these points, but certainly this idea that we have a crisis is very widely held. So what is it about the current political situation that leads so many of us to talk about a crisis? Has the population arriving at the southern border changed? Is there something about federal versus state tension that we really need to think about? How is the administration in Washington dealing with the situation? How is Congress dealing with the situation? How are states like Texas and Arizona and cities like New York dealing with the situation? And most importantly for us here in this room as policymakers, whatever other labels we may have, concerned with issues, I hope, of social justice and democracy, what are the solutions? So in the next hour, I hope we're going to address some of these issues. And I'm really delighted that we have 2 very seasoned and wise experts with us to help us. So, Mayor de Blasio, if I may start with you. First of all, just big picture, does the US have a migration crisis at the moment? And if your answer to that is yes, how did we get here?
We have a political migration crisis, unquestionably. And I think this is a fantastic conversation because it allows us to get to what's happening that often is not uncovered and discussed. So I appreciate everyone being here. I appreciate the way you're framing it. And I also want to say up front, I appreciate having a colleague here who we may not be in the same party, but he's taken some very principled and brave stances on the immigration issue, which proves it can be done. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
I would say the political crisis versus the tangible crisis. We have a nation tangibly, economically, humanly, we have a nation in a different crisis, which is a crisis of population. Our birth rate has plummeted. Our labor force has shrunk. We have a profound challenge if we're going to continue to be a global power and continue to grow economically, that we're going to need people to do the work who are committed to it of all skill levels. And that's not going to be, it's not going to be sufficient to assume that's going to come just from who will be born here in America. So the entire superstructure of America, the entire concept that we are living by requires, in fact, more immigration at this point in history, as it did 100 years ago. That part is just plain tangible fact. But the political crisis, I think, stems from the extraordinary frustration that people feel. Working class people in this country, of all different ethnicities, because their standard of living has been stuck, or in some ways even has gone backwards over the last few decades. And I, as a Democrat, am frustrated. I don't think my party has addressed these issues well enough in the last decades. I think the frustration has grown to a point that opened the door for Trumpism. And I have plenty of criticism of Donald Trump, but I think it's important to recognize that he didn't spring up from the earth and suddenly create a socioeconomic environment. It was ripe for the picking, and in his own, I think, cynical way, he saw that. So I'll wrap it together and say, I think when you have a nation that once upon a time, not so long ago, I would say up through certainly the 70s into the 80s, had a fairly real functioning American dream. There was an actual possibility of social mobility for a high percentage of the population. There was plenty of exclusion and plenty of things wrong too. I'm not trying to paint a gauzy perfect picture, but there was real consistent social mobility throughout the entire post-war era, up through the 70s certainly. And then that not only declined, but in many ways reversed. So a high percentage of our population felt they were going nowhere, and they felt their kids could be worse off than them. And that's the environment where people get frustrated about immigration, and they get scared, and they listen to regressive populist voices. And I think it's actually incumbent, and I'm going to say this as a confessional Democrat, My party needs to do, and has for a while, needed to do a better job of answering that pain and that confusion and helping people find their better angels by giving them some hope that we could get somewhere again. And not to turn on the person who comes from another country, doesn't look like you, or speaks a different language, because that person didn't cause your problem in the end. There may be fear about what it means for a local school budget or something. If there's more kids, that's not an illegitimate issue. But in the end, that's not what's really going on. What's really going on is people having a profound anxiety about where their country's going, and particularly where they're going economically. And they're turning on another group of people and presenting them as the root cause. The immigrants are not the root cause of the problem. But more of us, and certainly more in my party, have to do a better job explaining that and showing solutions that allow people to feel more comfortable with the immigration we actually do need.
So thank you. So just to follow up on what you said, it sounds like what you're saying is that really
it's never a good sign when someone has to say, it sounds like
well,
what you're saying.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I'm just trying to put in a gloss. I'm not going to quote you verbatim, but I think what you're saying is...
If you had said, what the hell are you saying?
No. I think what you're saying was very clear. And what it was is that at a time of social and economic angst, anxiety about, your children's future being worse than yours, you need a scapegoat. But the scapegoat could be the people in the street next door. The scapegoat could be people who are very tall or people who are very short. Why is it immigrants? Is it because the leaders of our country or of our cities are suggesting this? I mean, when you say people who look different, America, unlike a lot of other countries, is already a country where everybody looks different. I mean, if you live in a big city like New York City or, not so much in Boston, but in many places, it's not monochrome. People look different. So why is it immigrants that are so often the target? Is it, and my suggestion or my hypothesis is that our leaders often use this conveniently. This is a great scapegoat. This is something that, would you agree with that? Do you think that this is why the border is perceived as being a situation of crisis, actually not a crisis at all? We can have over 2 point whatever million people coming in. It's manageable. This is a very big country.
No, I want to challenge that point real quick. It is manageable theoretically, but I think the atmosphere, the feeling of chaos, or the fact that there don't appear to be consistent rules and standards, that is something that I understand why that bothers so many people who try to play by the rules in their everyday life. And again, this is something where I think my party can do a better job. I believe in border security. I want border security. I want an orderly asylum process, an orderly process for people to come here legally. I also think we should acknowledge the positive role that immigrants play. So I think if folks see at the border kind of none of that, they see nothing that makes sense. But to your bigger point, I agree with you. I do think it's a conscious scapegoating. And by the way, in the area of race, this was the Jim Crow era in the South as well. A classic tactic used by people in power, turn the attention to the other, to someone who looks different, sounds different. So the attention is not on the elites who are actually running things, doing very, very well themselves, making out on the backs of working people. I think that's the fundamental political problem. And again, I think if the Democratic Party acted more like the historic Democratic Party and drew that line and said, well, guys, it's actually not the immigrant on the street, it's actually Wall Street, a lot of Americans would hear that. But the absence of that critique, the absence of that placing of responsibility where real blames, I wouldn't even call that scapegoating. I'd say placing responsibility with those who are actually making decisions that affect your lives leads to, yes, other leaders filling that gap and pointing fingers wrongly at immigrants.
Okay, so the last point I want to follow up before I turn to the Congressman is this. Your successor, Mayor Adams, commented recently on the fact that I think it's over 110,000 migrants have arrived in New York City, over half of them living in city shelters and emergency facilities, and said that the influx of recent migrants would destroy New York City. So it wasn't so much a question of pointing at Wall Street or pointing at else. He just said all these people arriving, over 100,000 people in this city, is going to destroy New York City. And when I read that, I thought to myself, well, is it 8 million people who live in New York City? Why is it
closer to 9?
Closer to 9 million people who live in New York City. Why did the mayor say that?
I am not here.
You are not the mayor. I realize that. But would you? I guess what I wanted to ask you is.
Let me say the way I say it.
Yeah.
It's messing up the city budget. That's a true statement. and it's much more, many more people than we have shelter capacity for. That's a real challenge. My loving follow-through would be to say New York City is extremely strong and resilient. We were the epicenter of COVID, and we came out and recovered with shocking speed. And New York City ain't going nowhere. It's not destroying us. It is a problem, but it's not destroying us.
No. Okay, thank you. So Congressman Denham, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to start by, maybe if I may, just ask you the same question I asked the mayor, which is, do you think we have a migration crisis at the moment? Or do you think we have a political crisis? Or how would you explain why we are where we are?
Yes, I think we have both. And I don't think that this is a crisis that just happened all of a sudden. I would say that this has happened over the last couple of decades. And I think both parties deserve some blame on how this has grown and how it's been politicized. It's not so much about the number. I do agree that more immigrants that come to this nation of immigrants can add to the success of this country, can add to the success of our economy. But we're also a nation of laws. And rule of law is something that I think is not only important, but I think people expect it. And when people see unfairness in the distribution of this law, of a number of different laws, I think there becomes more and more frustration, which creates more political angst.
So can you give us an example of what you consider the unfairness?
Well, first of all, I say this is a crisis of decades because we've now had dreamers that are here that are multi-generational. And so I think you can take it from one side of the aspect of this debate where dreamers have not been able to, prior to the law that we enacted as part of our immigration debate, the Enlist Act, prior to that, you couldn't allow immigrants to serve in the military and gain citizenship. You couldn't allow them the opportunities to go to college, opportunities to gain gainful employment, benefits. So there are a number of different issues where, we used to talk about children that were brought here to no fault of their own. Well, these children have children now. And, the repercussions of deporting somebody who is not here with all the rights of citizenship, to deport them to somewhere that they've know of no other country as their home but this one, and have their kids who are actually citizens and now adults at the same time. That's why this is a crisis of I think, multi-generational, but certainly not one that is...
I'm so happy to hear you say that, and I could not agree with you more. I think one of the most flagrant injustices amongst many in our immigration system is the failure to move ahead with DACA and the failure to give these people kind of like some final sense of security. Mm-hmm. But I just wonder if I could take you back a little bit now just to where we are now at the border, because I think when many people talk about the migration crisis, they're not thinking about, dreamers. Maybe they should, but they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about the 11 or 12 million undocumented. They're thinking about these images of people, people are calling it an invasion, the governor of Texas and some of I guess, people in your party in Arizona talking about this, invasion that Biden that President Biden is supposedly, facilitating. So, I know that at one stage, I think in 2018, you co-sponsored something called the Border Security and Immigration Reform Act. And that was a complex and interesting piece of legislation I've looked at. Yeah, multifaceted. And I think your, absolutely, to my mind, laudable preoccupation with dreamers was also part of it. Yeah. But another part of it was allocating $25 billion for funding the construction of a wall. Do you, and we know that in the previous administration, building the wall was a huge plank of immigration policy under former President Trump. Do you think that building a wall is still something that is important? Do you think that border security, that the answer to border security, or that one critical component of the answer to border security is a wall? Like if President Trump or former President Trump is re-elected, would you support him in re-upping that whole agenda?
I support more border security, and part of that is the structure of having a barrier, as most countries have barriers, as many elected leaders have barriers around their house or around their communities. I think that it is an important piece. And if you take a look at Customs and Border Patrol, their advice, their recommendations, it's more than just a barrier. It's a safe barrier that keeps their lives safe as well. If you go along the San Diego border or the southern border in California, we're still using Vietnam runways as border security. We can do better. I mean, we brought back the runways and then stood them up, and those are the things that make it a difficult barrier for our CBP. The new barriers are much less penetrable, but part of border security is making sure that we've got CBP, the proper resources, the tunnels that go across our border sealed, making sure that we have security along many different aspects of our border. Now, a border wall is not going to solve our problems. We still have big mountain ranges, we've got rivers, our border is something that is very different depending on which state you're in. I mean, part of our border is, Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So I think that we have to look at border security as an overall process, and that funding would go to all of that. But I think all of it is critical. And I think you've got to be able to, if we're going to have a real honest debate across the country, I think that you need to be able to let the American public know that the government is doing the right things to make sure that we've got a full solution. Border security is part of that solution.
So if I could just follow up on that, I mean, I hear what you say that, the land border and a high wall is only part of it. There's some people who argue that border control can't actually be achieved at the border alone. It's a much bigger problem. You have to have multi-agency collaboration. You have to have maybe,
Sure.
I imagine what some of the advocates call for is something like a one-stop shop, like you might have for medical care, you have, pediatrics and psychiatry and dermatology in one place. So similar here, for border, you would have multiple different disciplines, you'd have CBP, but you'd also maybe have ICE, you'd have, citizen immigration people, you'd have ORR, you'd have all these entities. So actually you were not just shoving problems somewhere else, but you were addressing them. How do you think about that? Do you think that's feasible? Do you think this is something that, because we are nowhere near there as far as I see it. We have a border where, you have the actual entry points, the official points where people are meant to enter and allowed to enter, and then you have all these spaces in between where people do enter, but they're not meant to enter. But even in the places where people are meant to enter, they don't really solve the problem. The problem is just shunted on to immigration court, the problem is shunted on with parole for a couple of years. It's not. So do you think that really a better use of resources might be, or you might not say better, you'd say we do need the border wall, but a really important use of resources is to think more synergistically, more holistically about how we bring these agencies together to work together? And do you think there's any prospect of that?
Certainly funding is always a challenge, but I think more importantly, we can't afford to have a patchwork of different pieces of legislation that, you pass border security today and hopefully you get to Dreamers 20 years from now and we do asylum somewhere in the middle. If we're going to address multi-agencies and have one-stop shop, as you put it, then we have to pass some real legislation that addresses all of those concerns at the same time. While I think that the bill that was recently voted down in the Senate had some good things in it, but if you don't address those other issues at the same time, I would say one of those biggest issues was asylum, not having the judges, not having the process, still having the detention camps and not keeping children together. I mean, it's children together with families. I think you have to have a bigger, broader discussion that brings all of those pieces in together so that you can pass it all at one time and give the American public the ability to say, yes, I agree with or disagree with certain parts of this legislation, but they're also getting it right with these steps so that we don't have to do this every single year or every single decade.
Can I ask a burning question?
Yes, no, please.
Because I'm so happy to hear, a Republican who can speak bluntly and honestly about the whole picture. And so I want to ask you, since you've been in the room, I have to imagine a lot of your colleagues were hearing from their agricultural sector in their districts that there wasn't enough labor. And a lot of them in other industries were using undocumented labor and hoping not to get in trouble for it, but they didn't have a choice, right? And looking at this situation, obviously a lot of industries want talented people from all over the world, so I have to imagine that your colleagues were hearing from a lot of people in their communities that they wanted that holistic solution, like the actual constituents wanted it. But I feel, I can only imagine how much pressure anyone would feel trying to get out of the box and talk openly about that. You were one of the people who did that. What was it like talking to your colleagues about, hey guys, this is obvious, we gotta show some courage here? Like what were those conversations like, and could you see something that would help Republicans to feel more comfortable with that big picture solution you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to work across party lines and to certainly start with a working group that then can expand. And the more that we expanded, the more that we had one-on-one discussions, and you learn, I mean, you know, Florida and Georgia are different than New York, and all of them are different than our politics in California. But when you understood each different perspective from each different member from different areas, both urban and rural, because we all have immigration issues, I think that helped to start building at least a whip list of, you could tell who was never going to get there, right, and who was going to be honest and open about, you know, are you there to create a greater country, or to get on, you know, TV to say wild things about immigration. And for me in California,
nobody does that, surely, Congressman.
And in California, you know, I came from a farming community, so certainly, you know, farm workers were a big part of this. But we also have the big tech industry, and we talked about the high-tech visas, and, you know, our intellectual capital. How many people graduate from the best colleges in this country only to never be able to work in this country? Correct. So, you know, we went from top to bottom based on the different immigration issues that affected you in your personal life, but you in your district as well. And we actually activated people in districts too. And we got very, very close. It's been amazing to me after Congress how many members, former members, have come back to me and said, you know what, if I'd have signed on to your discharge petition, we'd have not only had an honest debate, but we would have solved all of these problems that we're dealing with today.
Well, I want just a quick follow-up, and thank you for your indulgence.
No.
He's not following the rules, is he?
No, that's perfectly, actually
what does that get you, brother? You broke the rules too, okay? You in Congress.
This is within the rules. I'm in charge.
You drew outside the lines of your party, and I admire you. So, look, because it was George W. Bush, who I didn't agree with on everything, to say the least, but he actually tried a major reform and struggled with his own party. You know, you're talking about that process, and people coming back later and saying, wait a minute, I should have been with you. So my question, I guess, just to help us all understand is, how much are they feeling the people they're responsible to? Because I understand, I would not want to be a Republican who didn't agree, for example, with Trump on a particular issue and then had to catch hell over it. I've been there, you know, I understand how difficult it is to feel like you're going against the grain and it could have consequences. But the difference here is, I think there's a lot of folks in your constituencies, in all those states, who are saying, we need a solution here. Why didn't that have more impact in your view?
Well, I think the beginning of the debate was pushing legislation and going through the process and going through committees and following the general rules of Congress. Where we got outside of those lines is going to a discharge petition, bringing it to the floor, and actually going back to colleagues and saying, look, we don't have to agree, but let's have a debate. All I wanted was to bring a debate to the floor. Freedom Caucus, you can have your bill. Democrats had a couple of bills, RSC, Republicans had bills, and we played Queen of the Hill. Whoever gets the most votes, let's bring that package up, but doing nothing is not an answer. And I think that really challenged a lot of members to say, okay, you don't agree with me, bring your legislation up. You get a vote too. Vote on your legislation, vote on their legislation, but at the end of the day, we have an obligation to fix this for the country.
But we seem to be in a situation where that's wonderful sentiment that you just articulated, that we have an obligation to fix this for the country, is really not finding its place amongst, you know, elected representatives. I mean, the people who are really at the forefront, just think of, you know, what's happening in Texas, for example. You know, Governor Abbott, who I think is kind of like right out there. You know, he's, I think, spent $10 billion to block border crossers in Texas. He's really taking on the federal government. You know, I think everybody's probably read about the standoff in this 47-acre city park called Shelby Park along the Rio Grande, one of the most busy border crossing areas, where the Border Patrol, the federal authorities, were blocked from accessing migrants, as a result of which some argue people died. But this is still happening. This is still happening. And now there are people in Arizona trying to do the same thing. I just read in the newspaper today that, that this has been blocked, that the governor of Arizona has blocked the same attempt to really install local kind of, you know, Arizonan National Guard to prevent access to the Border Patrol. So what I'm seeing is, far from that kind of sentiment of let's fix this together, really to pick up on the mayor's point, there's actually a sense that people are trying to grandstanding for the more extreme position, which gets them some brownie points. Do you think that's unfair?
I think that's politics. You're talking about reading about it, where they're living it in Arizona along the border, or in Texas, where
but you know, fixing it,
property
right?
rights are being trampled on. Well, there's a difference between having to deal with it as a mayor or as a governor versus where the obligation really is in the federal government, and having Congress actually do its job, or the president actually doing administrative action to solve, even if it's a short-term solution, to have greater impacts on our border. Yeah, so I think you're kind of leaving some of these states or cities out to dry, and just telling them, so you got to deal with the problem. You deal with the problem for your city. You deal with the problem for your state. And this goes beyond, I think, politics. You had originally said Republicans in Arizona. I mean, you turn on MSNBC anytime. MSNBC is talking about what's happening, the crisis at the border, and showing the images. So this has been a crisis. Now it's a crisis that the electorate is really paying attention to, which is why I think it's going to be the number one issue in this election.
I respectfully don't agree with you on that, but I do want to agree with you on the previous point, which is, I think one of the things that elites should be really careful about is telling people what their problems really are. You know, like trying to dictate to people what they care about. When you're talking about property rights, if someone says, I'm worried about my property rights, well, they're worried about their property rights. Don't try and tell them they're not, right? Or if someone's like, I'm worried about the school budget in my community because a lot of immigrants are sending their kids to school. That doesn't have to be racist or unfair or grotesque. That might be they're worried about the school budget, right? And so I think some of what would be valuable here is to sort of meet people where they are. And again, some of that is fear that is not necessarily racism or xenophobia, of the fact that they feel their own economic decline and they are left in a state of confusion. And then I'm the first to say some of it is racism and xenophobia, and that's not acceptable. But I think the problem in this discussion that we're not grappling with enough is, yeah, that what you said earlier, that people see chaos. They don't like chaos. They want to believe it's a country with the rule of law, and they don't see that. And some of that is exaggerated, and yes, the grandstanding, but this is where I think we would be better served to say, you know, your eyes are not deceiving you. You are seeing real problems. Yeah. Let's now talk about how to solve some of those problems, but also tell you why that's not the whole story. Yeah. You know, that's not the whole story. No, and by the way, if it was perfectly orderly, you would want a lot of people to come here. The point you made, you'd want those. Why are we educating the best and brightest from countries all over the world just to have them leave when they could help us, right? Or why do we have, and I've heard this, you tell me if you heard this from your constituents, agricultural products that can't be harvested and go to waste? How is that good for our farmers? Because there's no labor. So I feel like, you know, that as they say in football, the best defense is a good offense. If we want to do something about this issue, we should present a vision of something compelling and meaningful to people rather than tell them, oh, your concerns aren't valid.
So would you say, is it unfair to say that the Biden administration tried to do that? They realized, I think, early on that having orderly entry was a critical thing, that the sense of chaos was the real problem. Yes. And so that's why they made this sharp decision between ports of entry and entry at other places, and really penalized people who were coming in up between the ports of entry, and tried to incentivize people to come through the ports of entry. But then they were unable to increase the number of asylum officers. Congress didn't pass legislation where you need to up the number of staff. So there's this terrible backlog. So you know, if people are really wanting to solve the problem, then why is it the Congress is blocking the effort to really fix some of these things that are necessary? You can't have an orderly process if you don't have enough people to process the people. If you say it's not about the numbers, it's about order, and I think we could all agree on that. That's really important. Why don't you have a situation in which, for example, you don't have people waiting 3, 4, 5 years for a decision on their asylum case? That's just nonsense.
But to be fair, if you're in the executive branch, you have to deal with what you are dealing with, right? With the hand you're dealt. You have a Congress that's not willing to help you. You don't have the ability to create money and have a budget without the Congress. And you have what tools you have. The executive branch has some powerful tools. It does not have as many tools as the American people tend to think it does. So then you're dealing with reality as it is. What do you say? What do you do? And I think the Biden administration in general, on most issues, has been extraordinarily effective. I think on this one, there hasn't been a clear enough vision and message. And so it started to look like chaos without a response, and that's part of the problem. And I think they got that memo now, and they're furiously trying to correct for it. But I want to caution that, you know, if we've got a stuck political process, as the congressman very eloquently just gave us insight into, a president can't will that away. So they have to take the powers and the bully pulpit and do something with it. And that's where we could have seen some more.
Yeah. So thank you. So Congressman, I wonder if I could, and I think we're running to the point where we
yes,
have to turn to questions.
Moment, yes.
We're at that, we have 1 minute left. You know, I see this tension between the state and the feds as being a very acute issue here. Immigration, as we all know, is a federal responsibility. But the real, where the rubber hits the fan, is really as you were saying, it's in the local communities, whether it's at the border, whether it's in New York City, in some of the boroughs in the city, whether it's in Texas and so on. How do you think this can be resolved? I mean, how do you think, you come here as a congressman, so you worked in the federal system, and you know, the mayor obviously was working for some of his time in public office in the city. How do we see this division of labor? Is it okay the way it is now? And if it isn't okay, how can we fix it? How can we improve it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that we have to have a full debate, but make sure that we're addressing all aspects of immigration so that we're not doing a patchwork. I think it can be done. I think that we used a unique process with a discharge petition and a kind of an all-of-the-above solution or a Queen of the Hill solution that allowed everybody to give their voice. I think it's still a federal obligation that we've got to get back to. And
I mean, for example, if the feds could, you know, move as people come in, you know, like they do with recognized refugees. We have about 160,000 refugees, people who come in already adjudged refugees, and they come in, and the federal government decides where they go, and they get funding, and they can work immediately, and they're distributed. And there are many communities that are crying out for more people, but we can't do that with people who come in at the border. And so they come in, and they are in Texas, and then, you know, Governor Abbott in his wisdom ships them to democratic cities to make a political point. That's a broken system. So, you know, you're saying that we have to deal with this holistically, but how?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to take a step-by-step approach, I think that the first thing you would have to do is address this whole asylum issue. You have to get the judges, you have to get the staff, you have to be able to process, and if that's getting more facilities, or under President Trump having a system where they don't get to come into our country until they have a spot, or they have an asylum date or asylum judge, or you've been assigned a process. I mean, I think that would be a place to start. But I think this crisis has grown so big, so fast, and is at this magnitude, I think you have to address the border in the process. That still doesn't fix dreamers in this multi-generational issue.
I totally agree with you. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. Okay, so now it's time for the audience. So we have 4 microphones, 2 down here and 2 further up. So you know the ropes, I think most of you. Please line up. I'll call on you. If you wouldn't mind just giving us your name and your one-line affiliation. And as they always say at Harvard and probably other places, a question is something that ends with a question mark. So, sir, over to you.
Hi, my name's Jack Flanagan. I'm a first-year student at the college. I'm from New York, so Mayor de Blasio, I'm quite familiar with you, and really thank you both for being with us here today. I spent much of my senior year in Port Authority Bus Terminal meeting those who were bussed up from Texas on buses, responding to, trying to get them connect them with city aid, get them aid raised by private NGOs. I'd love to ask Mayor de Blasio.
Not yet, President.
Yeah, perhaps at some point.
If only it were that easy.
One wishes. I would love to know if you were in Mayor Adams' shoes right now, would you be doing anything different? He was quite welcoming to the large wave of migrants until the past 8 months and has now sort of taken what's seen as a harder line approach. There's now an expiration date on your shelter. They remove you after some time. So that's my question for the mayor. For the congressman, I'd love to know, looking at that from a more national level, I really appreciated your remarks about how we need a holistic debate, and especially about addressing asylum. I think that people really underestimate how broken the asylum system is. When I was doing work in New York, we were seeing asylum dates into 2028. That's ridiculous. I think that this is a wonderful aspiration. I am fearful that our country is going to be able to actually get there. So I would be interested to know what, one tangible step, if you were in office, would you try and take to resolve this and sort of get a process going? Thank you.
Okay.
So,
let's start with the mayor. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, look, first of all, thank you for the work you did. That's right at the front line, and I know a lot of families must have benefited from that. And I want to say on your second question, just to cheat for a second, very simply, everything has a political solution. This is like, it took me decades to finally come to the full realization that everything has a political solution. And in the end, 3 elements of our government align and things happen. So the 2024 election will essentially decide whether we have the unity of government to make change or not. And I do think a lot of people should lean into that. If they care passionately, then go out and help create the conditions for actual change to happen by being involved in that electoral process. But to your point about New York City, without walking a mile Mayor Adams' shoes, and I want to be clear about that, I don't have the same information he has, and I don't have all the factors the ability to see all the factors he sees. But I would say, look, again, I don't think our city is being destroyed by this situation at all. We're incredibly strong and resilient, and we're the ultimate city of immigrants, and that's what's worked for us for literally centuries. And we should embrace that on the level of saying, even though we don't love what Greg Abbott's doing, we want to remember why we are the great city we are, and why we're the envy of the world is because of immigrants, including my own grandparents. So 1, 2, I think there's always more to learn in these crises about how to do better going forward. Work permits, clearly this is the area where we've seen some real progress, but we have to go a lot farther. The vast majority of people come here ready to work, and they want to send money back home. States, cities, federal government, every one of them have a role to play in the work permit process. That needs to be improved. That's an area where there's growth to be had. Helping migrants to live in family settings, their own or other families, who want to make some extra money, who are happy to provide shelter in exchange for rental payments or whatever you want to call it from the city or the state, is a more productive solution. I think to seeing some of that, I think there's more that could be done on that level. So definitely, as we've gone through this experience, I think we see there's a way to handle it better going forward. I also think the numbers are going to start to go down for the reasons we've been talking about.
Yes.
First of all, I agree. I think elections matter. I think it's important to elect people that want to solve problems on both sides of the aisle. We have far too many people that just want to be on TV and throw bombs a lot at their opponents.
Did you say Matt Gaetz? I'm sorry. I just thought I heard Matt Gaetz.
But I think that to the mayor's point, the president matters too. I agree with him that there's a limited amount of executive action that can actually be done, and most of it is very short-term action. But the president also sets the debate. The president's going to define what Congress takes up, what are going to be a president gets 1 or 2 major issues each cycle. This needs to be a major issue of whoever the next president is. It's got to be addressed. And I also, in this specific debate in particular, I don't believe that unified government is the solution. It hasn't worked under either party. I think that having a bipartisan solution, having a full debate, actually addressing it, I would not change the way that we address the debate back when we did the discharge petition, because I think it really gave everybody a voice. It allowed the extremes of both parties, it allowed both parties, it allowed several different solutions, and we got very, very close. And I think a lot of that had to do with the president at the time, but it also had to do with the speaker at the time actually bringing it up to a full debate and wanting to address it. Had you had a president that wanted to push the debate at the time and had a speaker that wanted to address it, having a two-party solution, I think is something that would have gotten us there. Yeah, we were close. We were very close.
Thank you. Yeah, Sam.
My name is Randy Feldman. I'm a graduate student here, but more relevantly, I'm a practicing immigration lawyer. In that capacity, I see about one person a day who comes from the border to our office. Talked to about 3 people a day who've done that. The situation, I'm a liberal Democrat. The situation on the border, and Congressman Denham, this is really for you because it's a border question. The situation on the border is completely out of control. And what I mean by that is the violation of the rule of law. People, it's not a matter of a wall. People will just simply go up to a CBP official and said, I'd like to apply for asylum. At least they used to. Now, they're so pressed for time, there is no credible fear interview. There is not even a credible fear inquiry. They're not even asking anybody why you're coming to the United States anymore. They're simply saying, do you have any relatives in the United States that you could stay with? Yes. Can you tell them to send you a ticket? That's great. We'll send you up there and we'll schedule you to go into court wherever you're going to be, in my case, Boston. You'll go in about a year, and we'll have a hearing in about 3 years, and your case will take about 5 to 7 years. And all people do is cross the border and be given that opportunity to come to the United States and go to court.
So your
That's what the
question's,
border's like. So my question is, I'm a liberal Democrat. What did President Biden do wrong? Is it that there's just too many people who are allowed to come across the border every single day to make that request? Is that there's no more detention? Is there not money for those things? Is the law against him? Could he have done that? What are we supposed to do to not be in the situation that we're in right now? Because this system is a complete violation of the rule of law.
Okay, thank you. So, Congressman, why don't you start with that, the federal question, and then we'll ask the Democrat to take it up afterwards.
Yeah, I think that the president should have made it a priority, and he should have made it a priority from day one. I think the challenge was, if he did not like the executive order that President Trump put in place, before reversing it, have a separate solution that then moves forward. And asylum would have been, if you didn't like keeping people.
You mean Title 42, or which one?
Yes, Title 42. Yeah. But if you don't, if the easy way to explain it would be, if you don't like the policy of keeping people in another country while waiting asylum, then fix the asylum system so that we can address that piece of it. And we would at least move the debate forward a little bit. But to your point, the American public gets very frustrated. This is no secret that somebody goes, seeks asylum, and it's going to be the backlog of several years. And a small percentage of those people actually come back to their court date 3 years later because they now have jobs and they now have families and they've lived in our country for a while. And we need to fix the underlying system. And I think that the president could have done more early, and now he's at a challenge where you're in a political debate, and to fix it now prior to the election is a challenge.
Well, very quick, I want to say it totally sucks to be a government executive, meaning the executive branch. And I'm not saying that facetiously. I'm saying this. The point here is he came in with a huge agenda and a series of crises, and then has to fit his response to immigration in the middle of all that. Now, this mistake, and I agree with you, to make a change in your predecessor's policy without having your own policy ready to go is extremely dangerous. I think almost every executive has made that mistake, honestly. So I'm having a little bit of like pure sympathy for the challenge the president faced, but I agree. I think if he had ordered his steps differently, it would have put him in a better position. But let's put in perspective why he might not have done that. He was focused, for example, on recovery from COVID, rightfully. First defeating COVID, then recovery from COVID, job one. He was concerned, rightfully, about the climate crisis. When he might have been able to turn attention to a new set of issues and make more structural reforms, what happens? Russia invades Ukraine. So I think we have to put in perspective the bandwidth question. I share a lot of your perspective, I really do. But I think we expect political leaders to be able to work on hundreds of issues simultaneously and get to that critical mass point for action. And it's literally not possible. When I look at what Biden did, I think every moment he put into addressing COVID and recovery, and every moment he put into the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of fighting the climate crisis, I wouldn't want him to change a thing there. And we can debate what's happened in Ukraine. I personally agree with the vast majority of his policies there, and I think it would have been devastating had he not done them. But the bandwidth reality is, okay, now there's only so much you can do, and you're going to try and tackle immigration, which, as we just heard, for decades has been almost impossible to find progress on. I think that's a lot of what's really going on. But the last thing I'd say is, in the end, where I'd love to see more, if you can't always find the tangible solution, at least provide the roadmap. And I think Biden has been tremendously good at providing a sense of roadmap on some issues. I think he's now has to do it on immigration for his own survival.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Victor. I'm an undergraduate here at the college studying government and ethnicity migration rights. I'm a former student of Professor Bhabha. You both are quite lucky to be up there on the forum with her. During my gap year, I lived and worked in New York in the city council and was able to tour the humanitarian emergency response and relief centers there. And while it wasn't a perfect policy, it was a policy instituted at the directive of the Right to Shelter law in meeting the goals there. Now, Mayor Adams has effectively done away with the Right to Shelter policy. And so my question is, of course, was that the right move in response here to the current crisis that we're experiencing? What are the responsibilities that cities have and the rights that they should be allotting to migrants upon their arrival, in your view? And additionally, what is the right responsibility sharing here among cities and suburbs in terms of meeting the crisis at the moment that we're at?
Very, very quick. I know some other folks want to ask questions. I only say, even though it's a federal issue and federal responsibility, in the end, something like right to shelter, I think this should be a national reality. It goes beyond the question of migrants. Are we surprised that San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle have massive homelessness problems when they don't have a right to shelter law? If you don't have the ability to provide shelter to people, you're going to have vast street homelessness. And I think that's true when there's a migrant influx as well. That's a much bigger danger, both to the health and welfare of the people who arrive and to people in our communities, but also to everything else that's the fabric of our life. So broadly speaking, I think we need to lean into right to shelter and in fact need it in many other places.
And I'll just add briefly, I do agree that there's a federal obligation here where the federal government, we have facilities that we pay for all across the country, and we ought to be doing more to be able to expand those facilities. And many of them I've toured a lot of them, especially the unaccompanied minor facilities. We've got some amazing facilities across the country. We just don't have enough of them. So if you're pushing people out or sending them, abroad, I think that there is both an administrative short-term solution, but there's also a congressional solution that we could fund these programs better so that it at least addresses the immediate impact.
But it is the case that this right to shelter, the use of the right to shelter legislation in New York City for migrants is new, right?
No, it's right to shelter is right to shelter.
The right to shelter is the right to shelter, but I thought it was used mainly.
No.
It hasn't really been used in this way for asylum seekers.
Real simple for everyone's benefit, and again, so we can get a few more questions in. It is the law of New York City, regardless of whether you've been there 1 day or 10 years. It's never been a distinction. And it's very logical, because if someone's going to end up on the street, that's the worst of all worlds for all of us.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, in fact, why don't we take a couple of questions together? And if you don't mind, I don't know if you need paper to jot it down or just remember. Yeah, please.
Hello, thank you for being here today. My name is Bibi. I'm a Master of Public Policy student here at HKS. And I wanted to pull the thread a little bit more on something both of you said, that immigration is a federal problem and federal responsibility, and also back to the crisis at hand, which is there are thousands of migrants at the border who are being bused to cities that can't handle it, and the budgets are facing strain, and this is a perpetual problem, right? Migrants aren't going to stop coming, and cities aren't going to stop being filled. So my question is, if this is the federal government's responsibility, what is holding up Congress? And in Massachusetts, a couple of months ago, we even saw a glimpse of federal cooperation where DHS had a pilot program to help with finding legal pathways to work for asylum seekers. That ran for about 2 weeks, and that was a huge relief to Massachusetts for those 2 weeks. So one, what's holding them up? The Congress to deploying resources to help with the immediate needs that these migrants in cities and states are facing, and two, are there actually any programs or ideas to mitigate, and like what those resources would look like?
Okay, so can we hold that question? Okay, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ashna. I am a student at the School of Public Health. I am also a dreamer and a DACA recipient, so this conversation is very personal to me, and I appreciate you both for engaging. I think if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not particularly optimistic about seeing immigration reform anytime soon, but I would love to hear your perspective on if it were to happen, what would need to be true to see true immigration reform in this country?
Okay, let's just take those two questions. So who'd like to go first?
I'll just say simply, he can speak better to both of them, I think, but very quickly. I hear the discharge approach and understand the power of that. I come from a world where incrementalism is often the best approach, certainly from the executive side. And what I'd say is, the experience with Dreamers actually gave me a little bit of hope, because that was an area where the American public was with the Dreamers, and we could make at least some progress. I think pulling out the pieces, so I'm going to combine the questions and say, I actually think the work permit issue is that the two things that give me hope are Dreamers and work permits, because I think we can form American majorities around them. I think we can peel off enough people who might be doubting in a certain other political party to be able to get us somewhere. And just step by step, it could take quite a while till we get that bigger political solution. But I think if we could start to associate migrants with, in fact, the thing they want to do, which is work really, really hard and contribute to the country, if we could pull that forward more, that gives us a framework to perhaps take the next step after that over time.
Yeah, first of all, on the Dreamer issue, I think it's one of the more difficult issues in the overall immigration process. And my concern would be if we go by a step-by-step approach, we just deal with asylum first, and then deal with funding, and then deal with the border security, then deal with everybody. There's much more bipartisanship on high-tech visas, but nobody wants to do them by themselves. So, I mean, you start taking all of these different things.
Hey, why not? I'm sorry to interrupt. Why not?
Why take them all?
Why not do it by itself? We get agreement, why not grab the agreement and go with it?
Because I think at the end of the day, after you've exhausted each one of these different issues, and it's taken a long series of, I mean, you know how long it takes to pass anything in Congress. So if now it's taken you 10 or 15 more years and you finally get to Dreamers, now you've got Dreamers that are in their 50s, 60s. I mean, we've now taken this problem way too far.
No, I'm saying why not do the high-tech visas? If there's a consensus on that, why not grab that one victory? Because it would have value for us.
Because I think I was going to say it's just the time that you're going to use on that. You're going to miss on other things.
Yeah, and I think
we're missing on them anyway.
But the same argument would be said, I think, on border security. If you just build the wall, whether you can do that administratively or you can get enough, if there's a big Republican majority, you get enough votes, you don't solve the problem. You just transferred one piece of the problem. But yeah, I get your point. We did pass the Enlist Act. It was a very small piece, but addressed one part for Dreamers.
Yep.
So I would take some incremental wins. I just don't want to give away some of the more bipartisan issues that then leave partisan issues out there that also need to get addressed.
Okay, we're out of time. We're just going to have these. Was there one question or two? Just each of you ask your question quickly, and maybe we'll just get one quick answer. Yeah, sir, please.
Hello,
Lightning round.
I'm Florian, public policy student here as well. I worked at the International Organization for Migration in Egypt before on cross-Mediterranean migration. And when you listen to EU policymakers, no matter on what side of the aisle, you always hear about international cooperation, whether that is on right-wingers in the UK with Rwanda or increased economic help and assistance. So I'm wondering, you said it, it's a multifaceted problem. Why does nobody talk about international cooperation for a global problem like migration here in the U.S.?
Okay, thank you. Small question. Yes, last question.
Hello, my name is Mar Sanjans. I'm a visiting fellow of the Harvard Center, Davis Center at the Harvard. I'm from Europe. So my question is about the world. So what kind of signal this crisis sends to the world? I mean, about America. And do American decision makers care about the prestige of America? Because obviously it's not doing good for the reputation.
So we have two kind of complementary questions. One about international cooperation, and one about how this situation at the border and this lack of order is somebody's pointing at something that I don't know. How this lack of order is actually affecting.
What did he say?
The view of America.
And
you are. I see.
We've been waiting for a long
Oh,
time.
I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see you. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Do you want to ask your question as well then? So we have one question on international cooperation. Yeah. One question we have is about the image of America in the rest of the world. And the last question, and my apologies.
Oh, no worries. So Dwight Hutchins, mid-career from '96. My question is actually builds off the young woman's question below on the federal nature of immigrants, right? Because they can't work, that's a federal law. I mean, there's a whole bunch of federal restrictions. So when you drop them, whether it's in San Antonio or New York or wherever, there's a lot of federal restrictions that the states don't have control over, and the cities definitely don't have control over. So why hasn't the federal government, federalized the issue in where Mayor, you said that 100,000 people don't destroy the city, but they destroy a budget, right? Well, why is it that New York City budget is blown and not Greenwich's budget or Atlanta's budget? I mean, it's a federal failure that New York City's budget. I mean, it becomes a localized issue of a federal problem. Why hasn't that been better federalized?
I think I want to jump on all three of these real quick.
Okay.
Then he'll have to do the tough answer. I'll do the big picture answer. You have to give the substantive answer. I think the three actually are fascinating taken together because they point out sort of the fallacy of American government. What I didn't know until I served was what federal really means. It's kind of another nice word for chaos. The founders were pretty conscious about this. They were worried about dictatorship. They were worried about a lot of things, so they built this very decentralized system. But in a case like this, it's not helpful because our politics have broken down, so we don't have the kind of ability to get to consensus we had at certain points in our history. Not all points in our history. By the way, we had a civil war, so we weren't always a unified nation. But at some points in our history, we could grapple with these big issues at a federal level. This is not one of those times. Then the federal system becomes an agent of chaos because no one's in charge. The wrong power aligns to the wrong resources. You can't get anything done. I think a question that comes off of that is what states and localities can do to just start owning the situation. If you've got 12 million people or quote unquote undocumented but are living among us, what is law anymore at that point, right? The whole thing is kind of a charade. So what can states and localities do to create alternative mechanisms because the legal construct is already kind of shot to hell? Equally on the question of America's prestige, this issue is very denigrating of our prestige, but so are a lot of other things, and it gets back to us having to fix our politics. I think the migration issue is kind of not our number one prestige problem right now. And then to the question of international cooperation, I don't think we have that sensibility except when it comes to military issues, I do think we do. But in terms of the notion that we're going to turn to Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Haiti, Venezuela, and figure out some common ground, that's not believable. And by the way, most of those countries are having their own profound problems, and they're also experiencing chaos. So I think international cooperation works well, perhaps today within the context of the European Union, where there's relatively stable countries with relatively strong central governments. It doesn't work where it's chaos trying to work with chaos.
Congressman.
Sorry if that wasn't rosy enough.
Not very rosy, I agree with you.
Yeah, I'll try to address these in reverse order. The prestige issue, I think, is important. You know, most of the world looks to the United States on a lot of the leadership that we have right now, and I think that some of the media perception around the world right now is we're not handling this problem well. It is critical. And the piece with dealing with this internationally, we do, it's just not sexy. You know, we do have, you know, anytime somebody brings up, you know, we're going to deal with our border issues with Canada, it's laughed about. But we do actually have immigration issues that we work with Mexico, we do, or with Canada. We do the same thing with Mexico. It doesn't get covered very well. The only time I can remember where the working between Canada and Mexico actually got a little bit of attention was when, after President Trump had worked on a couple of different issues with Mexico and migrants coming through Mexico, all of a sudden he started talking about the border wall and Mexico was going to pay for it. Then everybody talked about, well, do we really work with these other countries? And this sounds crazy. And but I think many presidents have tried to deal with the immigration crisis, dealing with this internationally with our two biggest partners, or our two border countries, but then also understanding the issues that may come through Canada or may come through Mexico as well. But dealing with it internationally is critical. It's just not sexy in politics and doesn't always get talked about in the media.
Well, thank you all. I think this has been a rich discussion. Thank you both for very collegial, very interesting, and very insightful observations. We're really grateful, and thank you to all of you for being with us. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.